Welcome to the 36th Public Land Law Conference, Transcending Boundaries, Achieving Success in Cooperative Management of Natural Resources. I'm Paul Kurgis. I'm the Dean of the Alexander Blewett III School of Law here at the University of Montana, and I want to welcome you all to campus today for this important conference on these issues that are critical to our region and our nation and the world. This conference grows out of the work of our longtime faculty member at the School of Law, Marjorie Hunter Brown. Professor Brown launched this conference in 1978, initially as a way to showcase student writing, and then in the years since, under the leadership of our Professor Ray Cross and now our Professor Michelle Bryan, Professor Martha Williams, the conference has grown into a nationally prominent forum for the consideration of these critical issues involving public land law, natural resource law, and in many cases, Indian law. Now, throughout its history, the conference has remained a student-led endeavor with the editors of the Public Land and Resources Law Review organizing the conference and publishing the papers. And that's the case this year as well. We have Hannah Kale is the editor of the Journal, whom has organized this conference along with the support of so many of our students on the staff of the Public Land and Resources Law Review. And it's their work and their dedication that makes this conference a success. Both the Public Land and Resources Law Review and this conference have a distinguished history of leading the discussion in these key issues of public land law. Our journal is the only journal of its kind in the country devoted exclusively to issues of public land law. And this conference is the focal point of its work and its publications. Leading scholars in the field have all published in our journal multiple times. Many of them have spoken at the conference, as have the top academics and the top professionals in the areas that we cover. We've brought people together across the disciplines to find real solutions to the problems that confront the Rocky Mountain region in particular, as well as our nation and our world. And that emphasis on interdisciplinary approaches to solving real-world problems is reflected in our mission as a law school. We are unique, I think, in our mission, in the three pillars of that mission. First, our goal of preparing students for the people-oriented practice of law by integrating theory and practice in a competency-based curriculum. That's language I've never seen in any other law school mission, and it's significant. People-oriented. We endeavor to help our students become practitioners who can go out and help real people solve their real problems. And we do that in a unique educational way by bringing theory and practice together. And we were one of the first law schools in the country, if not the first, with that explicit educational goal. You see that goal reflected in this conference, where we bring together both practitioners and academics to consider these problems that confront us in a way that we hope will further not only dialogue and debate, but real problem solving. The second pillar of our mission is to serve as the academic legal center for the state of Montana. We strive to address the issues that face our state, and none can be more important than the conflicts over natural resources, and related to those, the difficulties of navigating those conflicts when they involve both tribal lands and state lands and federal lands. And so this conference fits directly within that part of our mission of reaching out and seeking to solve the problems of our state. And finally, our third pillar of our mission is to contribute to the development of national, state, and tribal law through teaching, scholarship, and service. It's significant that we include tribal law in our mission. As the only state in the country with 7 separate Indian tribes and reservations, we have a unique set of problems relating to Indian country and tribes, some tribes that are very economically successful, some that are facing significant economic and social problems. And we see part of our mission as helping to bring economic development to those areas, or helping them find economic development for themselves in ways that are sustainable and promote a healthy environment. Yesterday, the conferees, those of you who were able to, took a trip to the Flathead Indian Reservation to see both the National Bison Range and the newly named Salish Kootenai Dam. These are both examples of cooperation in progress. And I say in progress because neither one of them is a complete example. They are in very different stages of progress. And it's important for us to recognize that cooperation does not mean the absence of conflict. In fact, successful cooperation means managing conflict so that progress can be made, and progress is often incremental. This was the focus of our keynote last night by Hillary Tompkins, the Solicitor of the U.S. Department of the Interior, when she talked about finding the ingredients for the secret sauce for successful collaborations. As she said, conflict can be the catalyst for finding solutions and achieving cooperation, but it must come with other things. It must come with the right messenger, in the right setting, and with the creativity to think outside the box and find problems that may not be immediately apparent. In this conference, I think we have the right messengers. We have an incredible set of panels here in one of the most beautiful settings you could find for considering these issues. And we have the creativity in this room to at least begin to find some solutions to the problems that continue to bedevil us in managing our natural resources. Our program today leads off with our panel on water resources, moderated by an expert in conflict resolution, our own Professor Matt McKinney, who heads up our Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy and leads our Natural Resources Conflict Resolution Program, which is the only one of its kind in the country. And I'll let Matt introduce his panelists. Our second panel will feature, as a moderator, our Professor Martha Williams, moderating our wildlife panel. Martha is herself a former deputy solicitor at Interior, where she advised agencies on parks and wildlife issues. After our lunch address by Peter Culp of the law firm of Squire Patton Boggs, Professor Monty Mills will moderate our energy and climate panel. Monty joined us this summer from his role as Director of Legal Services for the Southern Ute Tribe in Colorado, so he has a lot of hands-on experience with these issues. And then we'll close our conference today by recognizing Professor Raycross for his long service to the school and his contributions to American Indian law in its intersection with natural resources. Before I close, I'd also like to recognize our own Professor Malin Smith, who has been instrumental in helping us put this conference together and is a huge part of our Indian law program. And I'd like to recognize our sponsors, Northwestern Energy, the Rocky Mountain Mineral Foundation, and the ABA section of Environment, Energy, and Resources for their support. I'll note that the online materials are now available, and West will send them to you electronically. We will also have our paper materials shortly. They are on their way. So with that, I thank you for coming. We look forward to a fantastic day, and I'll hand it over to Matt McKinney.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can you guys hear okay? Yeah, you can hear fine. Thanks so much, Paul, for that introduction and just that kind of overview of the law school and the history of this program, which is really exceptional and unique, as Paul indicated and as Nick explained a little bit last night. So just good morning to everybody. My name is Matt McKinney. I have the privilege of serving as an adjunct professor at the law school. and teaching and working with students across campus, not just law students, but forestry students, policy, environmental studies, geography, planning, public admin, et cetera, through our unique natural resource conflict resolution program. It's, as far as we know, the only one set up quite like it is, very unique throughout the country, and it's a ton of fun. It's just hugely energizing for myself and other faculty that have an opportunity to engage with the students. As Paul indicated last night, we had a very inspirational talk from the Solicitor General, Hillary Tompkins. She talked, again, as Paul indicated, about this special sauce and sort of some key ingredients for cooperative management of natural resources. We're going to dig into that a little bit more, beginning with this panel and then throughout the day. I want to thank Hannah and Nick and the rest of the team, the students, as well as Professor Bryan, Professor Williams for organizing, convening, getting us all here to have this conversation. Look forward to it. It should be a lot of fun. Before I introduce the panel and we get going, obviously this is the panel on water, I wanted to take a few minutes to try and frame the conversation, at least in part from my perspective. And as the sort of title of Transcending Boundaries, as some of you know, the term transboundary is an important term of art in some political and academic circles. It refers to water and other natural resources that cross international boundaries. So it has a very kind of unique, special meaning for some people. And that's important and that's useful. Other people, including myself, use the word to refer to any water or natural resource issue that crosses multiple jurisdictional boundaries. And so it could be international, it could be federal, it could be state, local, private, so on, or some mix of the bunch. So for example, this map illustrates that there are several local watershed groups right here in western Montana, right outside the door here. And since the focus of most of these groups and the sort of organizing principle is the watershed, most of them, if not all of them, embrace a landscape that crosses private, county, state, federal, and other boundaries. Likewise, there are several other watershed-based groups throughout Montana that similarly cross a variety of jurisdictional boundaries. If we scale up a bit, there are several interstate water compacts in the American West. All of these encompass 2 or more states, and most of them focus on water allocation. Most, not all. You'll see the Columbia River there, which will be the topic of one of our conversations here this morning, which is really more about flood control and hydropower development. Like the watershed groups, however, I think it's fair to say that these interstate water compacts are transboundary in nature, in that sort of softer, more colloquial sense, I suppose. Finally, if we use the strict definition of the word transboundary, there are 276 river basins throughout the world that cross 1 or more international boundaries, along with another 200 transboundary aquifers. These transboundary watersheds cover nearly half the Earth's land surface, account for about 60% of global fresh water, and support about 40% of the world's population. So, given the breadth of this challenge to transcend boundaries at whatever scale, I think it's useful to begin by reflecting for a minute on the history of how we got here, at least in the American West. In the 1860s and 70s, John Wesley Powell, who happened to be a one-armed Civil War veteran and college professor, led several scientific expeditions to explore the American West, including one of the first trips down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. In addition to serving as the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey and the first director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, one of Powell's most notable contributions to natural resource policy is his vision of what he referred to as watershed commonwealths. And he reasoned that there's a body of interdependent and unified interests and values, all collected in a hydrographic basin and all segregated from the rest of the world by well-defined boundaries. The people in such a district have common interests, common rights, and common duties, and must necessarily work together for common purposes. So this map shows, this is Powell's map that showed what these watershed commonwealths should look like, could have looked like. Needless to say, we didn't follow that model. We didn't follow Powell's advice in settling and developing the West. And as this next series of maps illustrates, we've effectively fragmented the watersheds of the West by local, state, and federal public land boundaries. So my sense is that the history of these local watershed groups, of interstate water compacts to some degree, is in part a process of aspiring to try to implement Powell's vision in spite of the jurisdictional fragmentation that we've imposed on the landscape over the last 125 years. So that's one perspective to take to this conversation, just in terms of kind of a historical reflection on how did we get here and why are we seeing such an enormous number of these local watershed groups, but also the need to have both interstate compacts as well as international agreements across international boundaries. So with that little bit of context, let me introduce our panel and we'll get going here. Sitting right here to my right is Jennifer Anders. Jennifer is one of two members appointed by Governor Steve Bullock to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Prior to that, she worked for a number of years at the Montana Attorney General's office. She'll be talking to us this morning about the Columbia River Basin and the Northwest Power Act. Next to Jennifer is Julia Guarino. Sorry if I butchered that. She's a research faculty member at the University of Colorado. She's affiliated with the Department of Geography and also the Getches Wilkinson Center on, I forget the name, it's so long anymore, Natural Resource Policy and Law Center at the law school there. And she's going to be talking to us about federal reserved Indian water rights. And on the end, batting cleanup is Eric Dannenmeyer. Eric is a professor of law at Indiana University. He's done a number of things with respect to transboundary interstate water issues over the years. Among other things, he currently serves on a joint public advisory committee under NAFTA and advises the White House and various federal agencies. So our presentations are going to be pretty short and sweet, I understand, 10 to 15 minutes, and our hope is to really then engage you all in a conversation about these particular cases, about these presentations, and to really continue to sort of build on the presentation last night by the Solicitor General about this secret sauce of cooperation and what that, what is that and what are some of those key ingredients. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Would you mind pulling up the Columbia Basin slide?
Oh, I can do that.
And then help me move through
On this
mine.
This slide there?
Yeah, sure, that's great. Good morning. Since this is the water panel, I'd like to acknowledge that we've just moved into a new water year, so cheers. As Matt mentioned, I'd like to talk about the Northwest Power Act of 1980. I understand that our focus here today is on successes because so often it's our inclination to want to talk about problems and what we do about them, but really from looking at a success standpoint, I think is a really healthy way to approach that. And since my work with the Power Council, I've become familiar with the Northwest Power Act. And in many ways, I do consider it a success, and certainly nothing that would happen under today's Congress. And basically, in a nutshell, what the Power Act did was a piece of congressional legislation that authorized a four-state body, which is the Northwest Power Conservation Council, to oversee energy development in the Pacific Northwest and to address fish and wildlife impacts of the Columbia River hydropower system. So let's get a handle on the political and geographic reality we're dealing with here. The Columbia Basin encompasses a geographic area the size of France. There's 1,243 miles of river flowing through 2 countries and 4 U.S. states. This is home to the federal Columbia River hydropower system, which consists of 31 dams, 14 on the main stem Columbia River. And most of these dams were constructed between the 1930s and the 1970s as part of the New Deal. Of course, they provide wonderful benefits to humans in terms of power generation, irrigation, flood control, and transportation. But they significantly changed the environment, and I think Matt, you want to help me out here? If you want to bring up my slides, I'm sorry. The map I'll show you now is, yeah, thanks. This is what the orange area is the area that was blocked by the construction of these dams. So we have significantly altered the environment and blocked the historic passage of salmon and steelhead in the upper Columbia and upper Snake River drainages. The larger dams in this system are regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation to provide power that is then marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration. And things may have continued as status quo since the 1930s had it not been for 2 significant historical events. And these events basically gave rise to the Northwest Power Act in 1980. What happened in 1976 was the Bonneville Power Administration and the Pacific Northwest Utilities projected a massive increase in load and insufficient federal power resources to meet that load. This prompted the public utilities to sign contracts to build nuclear power plants, but due to mismanagement and cost overruns, along with this erroneous demand forecasting that they predicted, this caused the utilities in the Bonneville to default on their federal loans to the tune of $7 billion back in the late 70s. It's a huge bankruptcy issue at the federal level. So there was that disaster on the power side of things. And of course, simultaneously going on was the rise in the interest in the 70s and 80s of the environmental movement and the corresponding decline of runs of anadromous fish. By the late 1970s, it's estimated that these populations had decreased from between 10 and 16 million fish historically, returning to the Columbia system, to about 2.5 million fish. You know, this was something that had been occurring over time, of course, due to overfishing, logging, a lot of other human endeavors, not just the dams, but it came to a head in the 1980s, and as many of you know, these fish were listed, many populations of these fish were listed during the 1980s and 1990s. So suffice it to say that Congress was alarmed enough to authorize the creation of an entity that would have authority over a federal agency, that being the Bonneville Power Administration, which is really a remarkable thing, and that's the council of which I am now a member. And we are 4 states, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, 2 members from each state, as Matt mentioned. And we have a specific congressional directive. Every 5 years, it's our obligation to prepare, to anticipate and meet the region's electricity needs through a power plan. We also, every 5 years, develop a fish and wildlife program to address the effects of the hydropower system. And our directive is to mitigate against those hydropower impacts. And we do this third directive with public engagement. So that's a really important part of what we do. Everything is done in public. It's very transparent. We try and involve many, many different stakeholders. In 1997, Congress amended the act to include a provision that would allow for scientific input, so that all of the projects we approve are subject to scientific review through the Independent Science Review Panel. That adds a level of credibility, I believe. And some of the accomplishments that we can see on the ground, the Council has protected, using Bonneville funds, 44,000 miles of protected areas. This means that, well, this is more of a policy decision. It's not actual on-the-ground work, but 44,000 miles of areas are protected from future hydropower development. We've improved the survival of fish passage through the dams. 400,000 acres of land has been preserved for wildlife. 2,400 river miles of habitat has been improved for fish. And we now administer the largest fish and wildlife recovery program in the United States, possibly the world, to the tune of around $300 million a year. And on the energy side, I'd like to say that we are also responsible for making sure that energy efficiency and conservation is the #1 resource that we go after before we try and build new energy resources. So some of the new directions we're exploring these days, opening up those blocked areas that I showed you on map 1. That's a really important thing for the tribes who historically relied on those fish, and now their fish are gone, have been gone for 75 years. We need to ensure long-term survival of species, so it's important not only to provide fish through hatchery production, but to keep an eye on wild fish populations. We need to think in terms of the ecosystem and what kind of objectives we want to set for ourselves. As Matt showed, there's a lot of geographic fracturing in the area, a lot of different objectives at different levels. Sometimes those conflict, sometimes they work together, but we like to think that as a four-state body, we can work to have bigger objectives for the entire basin and make sure that they're consistent. Invasive species is a problem. If we have zebra and quagga mussels coming in from the southwest or the Midwest, we have a big problem with our hydropower system, not to mention the habitat work we've done. And toxics is also a big concern for us at this time. So just in closing, what I really want to say about the work I've been doing in this panel is that I think our real accomplishments, they can't even be measured. You know, the one thing that the council does is we provide a forum in which we can discuss the tough issues that need to be discussed. I think if you left it up to 4 states to try and do that, or 4 counties, or 4 cities, or 2 countries, you'd have a lot of infighting, but we have a mandate, and we come together as 4 states, and we have to work together. We're forced to work together. Often that involves compromise, but that's okay. We get things done. We provide an opportunity for states and tribes to benefit directly from fish and wildlife dollars. So this isn't money that we manage, and we don't oversee the projects. These are being managed at the local level. I recognize some faces in the audience where you're administering these funds, and so it's a great opportunity to get the fish and wildlife managers involved. Probably most importantly, it allows the region to think about this as an ecosystem. This isn't 4 states, 2 countries, 197 counties, whatever. This is an ecosystem, and we need to think about it from a landscape perspective. It's habitat for a species. If we let that go, water is habitat. It's not just a resource for us, it's a habitat for other living things, and we can build the infrastructure within the council to be able to present that both at the policy level but also for the public. So to me, those are our successes, but we have a lot of work still to be done. So I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I think what we'd like to do is just get the presentations, and then we'll sort of open it up for dialogue after that. So if you have questions of sort of clarity and follow-up just about the work that Jennifer's doing in this case with the council, just sort of jot those down, and we'll get to them in a minute. So, Julia. Did you find it?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Guarino. As Professor Kinney mentioned, I'm a research faculty member at the University of Colorado Law School's Getchis Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment in Boulder. Yep. I'm currently working on a grant project for the National Park Service, eliminating their treaty-based obligations to tribes in the Intermountain region, while I also work toward a PhD in human geography at CU Boulder. I'm honored to have to be a member of this panel, and I also take every opportunity I can get to be in Missoula, so thank you. So my talk today is based on a policy handbook that I co-authored last year with a former research faculty member, also at the Getchis Wilkinson Center, named Julie Nania, who is now the Water Program Director at High Country Advocates in Crested Butte, Colorado. And the handbook is available online through the Getchis Wilkinson Center's website, and if you've come across it already, I'm sorry about the background, it's hard to read, but I'm hoping to get a cleaner copy up this fall. So the handbook is designed for tribal officials and policymakers to consider the options for and limits on the tribal development of non-consumptive water uses, such as in-stream flows. The project was funded by the Wallace Foundation and was designed specifically for tribes in the Colorado River Basin, but it's applicable to many tribes and communities in the West. So a quick caveat before I dive into the meat of the presentation. I'm not a tribal member, so my perspective is an Indian law practitioner and researcher, and it's not a cultural perspective. And the handbook and the comments I offer today are intended as resources for tribal leaders to take forward. So this talk will approximately follow the format of the handbook. I'll start with a brief review of the nature of tribal water rights and the options and limits on non-consumptive use of those rights, and that will lead into a discussion of the 5 major legal strategies that we outline in the handbook for protecting non-consumptive use on or near reservations. So as the majority of you likely know well, tribes are sovereign governmental entities that, somewhat like states, are subject to federal law, but have the power to make and enforce laws within the boundaries of the tribe's territory. So tribal territory is generally defined by treaty or treaty-like agreements, which the Supreme Court held in the 1908 case Winters v. U.S. include water rights sufficient to make the reservations habitable under the federal reserved rights doctrine. And incidentally, the facts of the Winters case developed on the Milk River, which flows through the Fort Belknap Reservation here in Montana. That's the picture. So the Winters Doctrine ties tribal water rights to tribal treaties, reservation purposes, and traditional uses, and is sometimes at odds with the state systems of prior appropriation that generally are applicable to water users in the western U.S. State law does not apply, however, in most circumstances to tribal land, and state water law does not apply to tribal Winters rights. However, a 1952 congressional amendment called the McCarran Amendment requires that Winters rights, along with other federally based rights, be included in state stream-wide adjudications. Therefore, Winters rights are still quantified and given a priority date in the first-in-time, first-in-right system, largely because they generally come out of shared water resources. The priority date is often the date of the reservation, but sometimes it's time immemorial, both of which generally amount to first priority. Many tribes have not actually had their Winters rights quantified and are not using large portions of the water they are likely entitled to under the law, which deeply complicates water management in and around Indian country, especially as water becomes ever more scarce in the West as a result of climate change and long-term drought. Lower courts have sometimes been inconsistent about the standards by which they quantify Indian federal reserved rights in these state adjudications and have occasionally constricted tribes' abilities to make creative, traditional, or non-consumptive use of their rights on or near reservations. One area in which the law is fairly clear, however, is when it comes to the protection of water to support tribal fisheries. So we'll talk about that for a minute. Most of the reservations in what was formerly the Northwest Territories of the United States were established in treaty negotiations during the mid-1800s with one individual named Isaac Stevens, who included the language that tribes retained, quote, the right of taking fish in all the usual and accustomed places, in almost every treaty he negotiated. This language has proven powerful, interpreted by the Supreme Court to mean that tribes retain the right to fish despite conflicting state law-based property rights, and has been interpreted by courts in the Ninth Circuit to include an accompanying right to in-stream water flows to maintain those fisheries, even outside reservation boundaries. Although protection for in-stream water for fisheries is well established, there have been some inconsistencies in court rulings on who gets to determine how winters' rights are used and whether they can be used for things that would not be permitted under the first in time, first in right state laws beyond fisheries. Tribes can also hold state-based water rights above and beyond their winters' rights, and individuals can hold state-based rights within reservation boundaries. And all this leads to a handful of questions about jurisdictional authority. So the first is, what is the extent of tribal authority over winters' rights, and do states actually have any authority over winters' rights legally? And although the basic tenets of federal Indian law, including tribal sovereignty and the rules of treaty interpretation and the federal reserved rights doctrine, would all indicate that tribes have full authority over their winters' rights within reservation boundaries, the Supreme Court of Wyoming held in a 1992 case that the Wind River tribes were required to go through the state legal system in order to change the use of their winters' rights from irrigation to any other type of use. And the Supreme Court, without issuing any opinion, upheld Wyoming's decision, which has left the law in a state of some confusion. There's very little in the law that would otherwise support Wyoming's interpretation, but no subsequent Supreme Court case has overturned it. Other courts in other states have rejected Wyoming's interpretation, however, so it's all up in the air. The second issue is whether tribes have civil jurisdiction to regulate state-based rights within reservation boundaries. Courts have been split on this issue under the exceptions described in the seminal case on tribal civil jurisdiction, Montana v. United States. And the question that emerges from that case is, does the tribal regulation of rights of water use within the reservation boundaries constitute an issue that, quote, threatens or has some direct effect on the political integrity, the economic security, or the health or welfare of the tribe? It seems to me that the answer is pretty clearly yes, but lower courts have answered the question in various and somewhat inconsistent ways, and the Supreme Court hasn't spoken, so uncertainty remains on this issue as well. And finally, there's the question of the extent of federal authority over tribes' winters' rights. And as with other Indian law issues, Congress has plenary power to regulate Indian water rights and can make unilateral decisions about those rights. Tribes are also required to seek federal approval before they sell or trade or lease those rights, and some tribal constitutions require federal approval before a tribe can even implement a water code. So another layer of complexity. So given this mess of law and jurisdiction, what's the tribe supposed to do if it would like to make non-consumptive use of its winters or state-based water rights? And the answer varies, of course, based on where the tribe is located and which court opinions apply or don't. But there are some ways around the traditional legal avenues that some tribes have been exploring. So the handbook presents 5 major strategies for tribes wishing to protect non-consumptive water uses on or near their reservations. The first is negotiating water settlement agreements to include in-stream or other non-consumptive use protections. The second, developing a tribal water code that protects and allocates resources to non-consumptive uses. The third, irrigating for in-stream flows and or traditional plants. The fourth, leveraging federal laws that tangentially protect non-consumptive water uses. And finally, tribal conservation easements. So I'll describe those. The first strategy, negotiating non-consumptive protections as part of water rights settlements, is fairly straightforward to describe and extremely difficult to address. See, for example, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai water settlement debates in the Montana legislature this past summer. The advantage of settlement is that it can avoid the uncertainty of federal law around non-consumptive water uses and allow the tribe, the state, the federal government, and other interested parties to craft an agreement that provides for the needs of all who are affected. However, most tribes end up giving up a portion of the water to which they would have a legal right during these types of negotiations. The second strategy we explore in the handbook is designing a tribal code that protects and provides a mechanism for administering non-consumptive use on the reservation. As we point out in the handbook, a code can serve as an important means of clarification of the tribe's stance on non-consumptive water use, both within tribal governments and communities and in interactions with outside entities. If you're interested, the handbook details specific example provisions from tribal water codes and describes some success stories. The third strategy, irrigating for in-stream flows or traditional plants, is a relatively untested strategy. We present this as a final strategy in the handbook and one that can be employed as part of a host of options or used to circumvent unfavorable case law. So the Wind River Tribe's proposed Riverton East project, which has been in the works for a long time but hasn't come off the ground, would make use of this strategy by applying senior irrigation rights to a major irrigation project on the downstream end of the reservation, in part for the purpose of ensuring sufficient stream flow in the stretch of the Little Wind River that flows through the reservation. In the handbook, we also suggest the possibility of a tribe developing irrigation projects specifically for traditional plants. So for the fourth strategy, leveraging federal laws to protect non-consumptive use, we identify two major federal laws that provide strong protections, although also come with some drawbacks. The first is the Clean Water Act, which of course is designed to protect minimum water quality standards, and usually this is in the form of maximum parts per million or particulate pollutants or temperature standards, both of which are sometimes achieved through requiring polluters to dilute pollutants or regulate temperature with increased water flows. Enforcement of the statute falls on the EPA, but states or tribes that meet certain criteria can step into this enforcement role. Courts have found that when tribes are approved as enforcement bodies, their authority includes the ability to implement higher water quality standards than those required by federal law, and the power to enforce those higher standards on upstream state users, so that can be a powerful tool. The second federal law we discuss is the Endangered Species Act. Occasionally, tribes have sued under the ESA to protect traditionally used native species and have sometimes been successful at enforcing minimum stream flows to protect fish and other wildlife this way. But tribes are also sometimes hesitant to work to have a species listed because, of course, tribal members will no longer be able to hunt or fish for that species if it's listed. So finally, just as a pretty powerful example, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are experimenting with one of the fairly untested strategies, conservation easements, as a host of strategies they're using. Conservation easements are essentially contracts between private landowners and a private land trust or designated government agency which restrict or prohibit certain land uses. Usually conservation easements are granted to the land trust or government agency in perpetuity and are included in the property's deed. The restrictions can include protection of riparian areas and water bodies and or restrictions on the development of water resources. Because tribes are governmental bodies, they can take on the role of either the landowner or the government agency that holds and enforces that conservation easement. Confederated Salish and Kootenai have been experiencing with jointly owned and managed conservation easements in cooperation with the Trust for Public Land, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the Bonneville Power Administration. Tribal leaders at Confederated Salish and Kootenai cite the expense and lack of full control as two downsides to conservation easements, but consider them a useful tool in the case that a landowner is not willing to sell an important piece of land to the tribe. In conclusion, there are large and looming water resource challenges facing all of us living in the West on and off reservations, and those challenges are likely to linger long into the future. Here in Montana, with several tribal water compacts sanctioned as law, you're ahead of the curve in terms of clarifying and quantifying what remains in much of the West a sleeping giant of large quantities of unused and very early priority water rights owned by tribes under the Winters Doctrine. As our collective available water resources likely will continue to become ever more scarce in the future, the problem of management that can maintain and sustain growth in the communities we love in the West will become more pressing and more daunting. Many of you know this better than I do and have been working on finding solutions far longer. but I'm sure it will take many lifetimes of work and will require all of our creativity and cooperation. But I have faith that it's possible. So, thanks.
All right, I need to check in with Eric real quick before I get started,
Tell me.
because otherwise he'll talk all day, which might be good. You want me to give you a 5-minute warning after you start?
Tell me when I've been talking for 5 minutes.
All right.
Because I could spend my entire allotted 11.3 minutes just thanking you for inviting me here, telling you how long I've respected and known the work of Professor Brian, and how much I'm looking forward to the work of the relatively new professors, Williams and Mills. What a wonderful place to be. And I should also confess that last winter, as you know, or as you heard earlier, you may not recall, I teach at Indiana University. I was in New York with our National Environmental Law Moot Court team, and we made it to the quarters, and we were clearly the second best team in the room. My team from Indiana was defeated by the team of Hannah Kale, Lindsay West, and an alum from your school, Caitlin Hepburn, and they were amazing. The coach, the professor advisor, shouldn't be sitting in the back of the room saying, "Damn, they're good," right? And my team felt no humiliation in losing to such a strong group of advocates who went all the way to the finals. So we were watching you, on the I guess closed circuit TV from a distance as you rose on up the ladder. So well done. So there, hopefully that's my 5 minutes, right? So now I'm at the 5-minute mark, and I'm down to a very few minutes to, oh, this looks different from that. I guess I'll have to watch that. To tell you what I came here to tell you. First of all, the very noisy first slide. I teach at Indiana. I'm actually presently a visiting scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, and actually came here from New Orleans. I've been down at Tulane in New Orleans for most of the past month doing some research. I've got a research project that I'm going to tell you a little about today. Well, I guess this is about success stories. Let's call it a future success story. It's a challenge, and part of the reason I wanted to come here was not just to reconnect with this incredible faculty and see students and breathe the air of the West, but also to lay this out to you all who think in different terms and have different experiences here, and hope that I can get, through your questions and through your responses, not just here but on the breaks, get some insights about what I'm trying to do. Before I do that, I should probably explain that, yes, I'm also a presidential appointee to, I guess that doesn't work, does it? To the North American Commission on Environmental Cooperation. Now, if you want a real success story, this is one. This is a continent-wide commission that was formed pursuant to a trade agreement. The commissioners are the senior environmental officers from the U.S., our EPA administrator, Mexico, their Minister of Environment, Mexico's Secretary of the Environment is what he's called, and in Canada, the Minister of Environment. And we advise both our own country, so I advise CEQ, advise EPA to some extent on these sort of regional hemispheric issues, but we also advise all three senior environmental officers. So I have an opportunity to sit down with senior officials from all three countries and sort of push issues relating to environment, natural resource conservation. The monarch butterfly is the symbol of the hemisphere because it migrates from Canada to Mexico. And that's a success story, and I could frankly, and maybe at a different conference, spend a lot of time talking about that as truly regional cooperation. But since we're talking about water, I want to talk to you about the Mississippi River Basin, which I call, for purposes of my work, MISOMO. Not to try to rename it, but simply to remind people. I guess I should ask the question, how many of you are from Montana or have ever been in Montana? I'm expecting to see. Long enough to brush your teeth or flush the toilet? Okay. Anybody east of Helena? Ever been east of Helena in Montana? Long enough to brush your teeth or flush the toilet? Well, I was going to say then I'm going to take you on a trip to the Gulf of Mexico, but you've already been there. You're a Gulf state. Montana is a Gulf of Mexico state. Wrap your head around that. The Mississippi Basin, I mean, I know sitting here we look a little bit further west and think of the Pacific, but most of Montana is part of the Mississippi River Basin. And so I bring up the Missouri and the Ohio as a way of reminding of that. I know the folks down in Texas and Arkansas, the Arkansas Red Black River. I mean, so I'm leaving some out, but the acronym would be unwieldy. So please accept my explanation. The native term we're told for the Mississippi is named after, was the native word for what we understand means father of waters. That apparently originates from the Gulf peoples, maybe the Homa, and the idea that it's the father of all waters. It certainly is in the Gulf of Mexico, southeastern Louisiana. Much of southeastern Louisiana is dirt that used to be in Montana and the Midwest and the Northeast. It's been transported there. You look at the Gulf of Mexico, it's a nice arc, a nice curve, and then you see this thing called southeastern Louisiana sticking out into it. That's the former Midwest and Northwest. So it's indeed the father of waters. Apparently the Choctaw people, when they encountered it, called it the ancient father of waters. So it was a common understanding. It's a massive system. It comprises 31 states, 2 provinces. There we are. You can see us now, the Missouri River Basin. So even Powell's vision of watershed-based states in the West, cut things off. If you want to take a true watershed approach, this would be the state. Now, I've outlined Missouri in red there. That's where I was born and I'm from, so near the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. And when I saw Matt yesterday for the first time, and I said, well, right now my work has only really made it up the main stem. And then he said, yes, of the Missouri. And he's sort of right. I mean, the Missouri River is, if you look at it, really there's more water coming, there's more watershed out here than there is in the Mississippi. I can't explain why the French explorers Joliet and Marquette decided that was the main stem as opposed to the Missouri. Joliet and Marquette, probably as the 2 French teenagers wealthy teenagers who worked their way up the Mississippi River and named a lot of things. Marquette later became famous for having a really high-quality university named after him. Joliet, a state prison in Illinois. I don't know that accounts for their personalities, but here are some data about Misomo, just to give you a sense of the size, the scope.
5 minutes.
Thank you. This is the so-called main stem. This is the part that's the Mississippi, and you get a little piece of the Ohio and a piece of the Missouri, but these are the states that directly flow, where their sheds directly flow into the Mississippi as opposed to through one of the major, I hate to use the word tributaries when I refer to the Missouri River, but please accept that that's not my term. And here are some of the challenges, right? Some of the challenges, and you can see these are mostly institutional challenges. I haven't yet talked about hypernutrification. I haven't yet talked about the pharmaceuticals. I haven't yet talked about Teflon, about the fact that it's hard to find a shirt these days, dress shirt anyway, that isn't that isn't stain resistant. And the chemicals that make it stain resistant are the chemicals that make up Teflon that end up in the water and that are not even part of our drinking water standards. There's a reason why when you get down to the Gulf of Mexico, people don't drink the water if they can afford to drink these big 5-gallon bottled waters. They just don't do it because you can clean out a lot of the organics, but the legacy chemicals, especially the stuff we're using now when we go hiking and camping and then wash our gear afterwards that ends up downstream, is a big new problem. I'm focused in part on as I say, the institutional challenges. Yesterday when we heard from Solicitor Tompkins, she talked about a catalyst. And I think had I done this slide set before I'd heard her speak, lack of compelling counterweight to ag, industrial, and domestic pressures, lack of outside pressure, lack of, well, there's the word catalyst. I guess the record will reflect I uploaded this before I heard her speak. So she's right. I will amend her comments in one regard. I think the catalyst needs to be a common catalyst. I think that the catalysis for those living down there, these are some pictures of the dead zone. This is what happens when our Father of Waters reaches the Gulf of Mexico. It destroys all life. I think the catalyst for that, when you're living on the Gulf Coast and you're a commercial fisherman, is rather obvious. The catalyst for those of you here who were part of the Gulf of Mexico, Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri Basin may be a little less obvious, right? Here you want to keep as much water as you can. You're trying to use it. Water downstream is water wasted, right? In a sense, they're getting it, and it's already been disadvantaged, shall we say. What my work is, and this is, let me just wrap this up in a couple of quick minutes. What my work is, and what I'm really thinking about, is how we take that father, the product of all of our DNA, how we take that parent, I guess I shouldn't gender it, right? How we take that parent, a product of all of our DNA, and how we find a way to cooperatively manage it. Boy, that's tough. That's naive, isn't it? What a pretense. That's why I'm an academic now, right? I gave up the private practice. I don't work for government anymore. Now I'm an academic. I can ask that kind of question. How do we take a system that's that vast, that means that many things to that many people, and imagine a comprehensive, cooperative framework? What's the catalyst for that? How do we get there? In 2008, the National Research Council issued a report referring to the system and calling it an orphan. I think my slide there says the word orphan. This is a 2008 report. It was an orphan in 2008. It's an orphan still. Our parent is an orphan. I love the metaphor, so I'm just going to stick with it. Our parent is an orphan. And it remains one. Here are the main issues identified in the 2008 report: contaminants that are both cumulative, that are legacy, and that are intermittent. Some things are contaminants sometimes and not others. Some constituents worry us at times, and at times they don't. Heck, even the push for sustainable renewable energy has had a negative impact on our parent, because biofuels, the market pressure for biofuels increases the pressure to irrigate, increases the pressure to use ag chemicals that hypernutrify the system. The lack of even basic information and data gathering, a challenge. Now, this particular quote calls out EPA. The report calls out every federal agency that's got its fingers in it. There's a lot of agencies involved, right? There's a clear need for federal leadership. Now, that's a challenge right there, isn't it, in this day and age? A lot of people run for office, for federal office, on the basis that there should be no federal leadership. Take that one, right? Take that one. So you can imagine there are even some political will issues. There are some broader issues in a democracy where we're having this fight about how do we all get together, when one of the solutions is to get together, and there are a lot of folks who want to get elected so we don't work together. I don't know. It's a paradox I'll deal with, perhaps. Now, hey, you would think that was 2008, that's then, this is now. The last workshop, still an orphan, still problems. Clear need for leadership. Where does it leave us? Well, my argument is we do need some coordinated, system-wide action from agencies with national authority, or at least the will for regional cooperation. What are some models? Well, I have done a lot of work in the Great Lakes Basin since I've been in Indiana for the last 6 years. Incredible model, the Great Lakes cooperative efforts. There's even a Great Lakes czar that President Obama appointed, Cam Davis. Brilliant guy, worked on the lakes issues for a long time. The first time somebody in the administration specifically focused on the Great Lakes. But we've been cooperating on the Great Lakes for over 100 years, mostly transportation issues, border, treaty issues, international border issues. That cooperation ended up being a basis for institutional conservation management. And we see the same thing in the Columbia River, right? We see the Columbia River Treaty from 1964, building a system that at the time was focused on flood control, although I guess the Corps calls it flood management now. They've given up that pretense, perhaps. Flood control and electricity has now evolved into a system that also adds ecosystem, they call it functions because they're engineers, but ecosystem values, shall I say. We heard about the U.S. effort in the commission, the Federal Power Commission. These are institutions that weren't born to do environmental work, right? They weren't imagined as environmental institutions. They were imagined as cooperative institutions pursuing economic goals. Turns out they also have this amazing other function that in some ways has become, at least to my mind, more important than the basic, turn on the lights, turn off the lights stuff. So I'm sorry, I said Commission Council, Northwest Power Council, and Conservation Council. So the idea is, and I know the council had a conservation mandate from the beginning, but as we heard, the original catalyst was, gee, we've blown it on our electricity calculations. So I guess what I'm saying is if you look at these other models in other basins, maybe not as big or as problematic as the Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri, maybe they are relevant examples for us. So, to me, they're relevant so far. One more slide after this, my friend. Institutions matter. And the economic goals matter because they're a catalyst. They tend to be a common catalyst. Public access matters. Each of these two examples I've given, and there are many others, are all about public access. The idea that the council has appointees by governors who come from not elected position, but come from the people and have a relationship with the populations as well as with the government, that's critical. And so what I'm hoping is, although it's too soon to tell, and yes, it's naive, I'm hoping that we can learn from these lessons of other basin systems, that we can borrow from them. And there are some nascent efforts in the Mississippi, mostly along the main stem, and in the Missouri. And I don't want to gainsay those. I don't have time to really get into them. There are some nascent efforts, but so far, not an effort to really pull the whole thing together and think of it as a system. So I'll leave you there, and thank you for your attention, and thank you again for the invitation.
Great, thank you, Eric and Julia and Jennifer for those presentations. And what we want to do for half hour or so is open it up for your questions. And if need be, we can take a couple, 3 at a time, and then let the panel members sort it out amongst themselves. But anyone like to begin? Yeah, over here. Are we going to have a mic? Yeah.
Just a quick question. One of the things that we're seeing in Montana now is that the state of Wyoming's become very concerned about their ongoing water supply and the upper reaches, some of the drainage that go into southeastern Montana, and I think they've funded a legislative study to build about 14 or 15 new dams for off-stream storage. And I'm wondering, I guess I'd ask Professor from the university, what are the mechanisms other than litigation and Supreme Court to address those sort of off-stream storage plans that are typically outside of the scope of normal allocated water use, let's say just grab most of that water?
So it's a question on alternatives to litigation with respect to claims by the state of Wyoming with respect to the Yellowstone and the tongue? And the powder, okay, very good. Jennifer?
It just so happens that in my stint at the Attorney General's office, I worked on the Montana versus Wyoming litigation. So there is a compact in place, the Yellowstone River Compact, that apportions the water between Montana and Wyoming. Of course, me wearing the Montana hat, I would say that what you're proposing is probably a violation of the compact, but unfortunately it would probably have to be litigated. So, and it is currently in litigation right now. So I guess the long and short of it is, hopefully that's a question that would be answered by the compact, so there would not be unfettered development by our neighbor upstream.
A follow-up or good enough? Okay. I'm just curious, Jennifer, by way of follow-up, I mean, is there some sort of a catalyst? I mean, is the litigation itself, the solicitor last night talked about oftentimes litigation or the threat of litigation can be that sort of catalyst that compels people into a more cooperative, negotiated approach. I mean, in this particular case, I don't know enough about it, but I mean, is there going to be a negotiated settlement, or is this going to run the course through litigation?
Ideally, there would be, because that kind of litigation is extremely expensive. Geez, I think we filed the suit in 2007, and it was still ongoing when I left the Attorney General's office in 2013. So, yeah, hopefully there will be an outcome that's agreeable to both sides. But the compact, unfortunately, was written rather vaguely, and so it's a matter of interpretation, and let's just hope those sides can come together and find some peace, because that would be good for everyone moving forward.
Okay. Other questions? Comments? Yeah. Please.
Question for Jennifer Anders. Do you think the model of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council could be scaled up for dealing with review of federal dams nationally? And I guess where I'm going is there's a lot of, when you look at the Army Corps and Reclamation in general, there's not really a very effective mechanism for them to review their environmental performance nationally the way there is in the Northwest. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Did everyone hear that okay? Over there? Not so much? Does the Northwest Power Act and the work that Jennifer is a part of right now in the Columbia River Basin serve as a model or not, or partial model, whatever, in terms of reviewing other dam operations by the Corps, presumably the Bureau, Reclamation, in terms of their environmental values and so forth? Because otherwise there really isn't sort of a model or a framework for doing that, correct, Jennifer?
You know, I'm not familiar with the Corps' and the Bureau's operations in the rest of the U.S. system. Perhaps Eric can enlighten us on that, but you know, the Pacific Northwest is really unique. Hydropower generation is the #1 resource, and on top of that, we've got the anadromous fish element, which, again, like I mentioned earlier, those two dynamics really force the issue in the Pacific Northwest. So whether there would be, whether it would, you know, serve as a good tool or a blueprint for the rest of the U.S., I'm not really sure.
Let me jump in and say I hope at some level, yes. The relationship with the Corps downstream in Mississippi is maybe at best frenemy. It's the #1 enemy of many people, blamed for the destruction in Katrina in New Orleans and blamed for channelizing the Mississippi and trying so hard to control it that when it does flood, it's a disaster. And that when it doesn't flood, it starves the wetlands of the freshwater hit. The Mississippi, by overflowing down further south in Mississippi, Louisiana, actually replenished the wetlands that are now receding, in part for that reason, and that no longer protect from storm surge. So the Corps is a is a classic historical enemy of many environmental groups. However, ironically, I mean, one of the things I'm doing through my work is getting down there and listening a lot, and at least a few folks I've heard who are in the middle of this down in southern Louisiana, you know, where the river deltas out, are starting to say, well, maybe the Corps is the only institution that has the capacity to sort of pull it together and think nationally, which is kind of interesting. It raises for me the question, we talked about this, and I don't have an answer, maybe someone does, on the way over, this recent rulemaking that EPA and the Corps did on jurisdictional waters under the Clean Water Act. I would love to know more about it and what that relationship looked like. In part because I work directly with the EPA right now and advise them, and you know, I've got enormous faith in Gina McCarthy and their senior folks there. They're, as far as I'm concerned, doing, by and large, really incredible things with a legislative framework that isn't going to change for a while, right? So I would trust the EPA as a driver, but the Corps may have, more capacity. And the question is, what's their, how do they really think about this? And so I'd be curious if anyone out here has any thoughts about either who have watched that rulemaking and know how that worked a little more, or who, have thoughts about it as well. I'm hoping that this is a good model. I mean, obviously, we need some kind of interstate cooperation. And that's one reason why, I will eventually work my way up the Missouri River and the Ohio and be learning more about these. We got to have something.
Any follow-up on that or other? Eric, I'm just wondering, sort of building on that, Jennifer put on the table that one of the keys to success in the Columbia River Basin and through the Power Conservation Council is scientific learning, and the fact that they've got this scientific review panel that reviews and revises, affirms, otherwise sort of legitimizes the information that they're using as decision makers with respect to power and conservation and so forth and so on. I'm just wondering, in the case of the Missouri, the MISOMO, I mean, I don't know if it's the Corps or if there's some sort of a joint initiative there. If information, scientific, technical information, can in some way, shape, or form be that sort of catalyst and that sort of hub around which people might come together.
Yeah, it is, and I hesitate to start this by saying I'm not a scientist, and therefore, nor am I running for president. So I guess it doesn't matter if I'm a scientist, right? Scientific information as a basis for environmental decision making. What a concept, right? Yeah, actually, it is. The science has been clear for a while, and even more than that, the engineering has been clear, right? The mechanism for starving the wetlands in the South has been obvious. The question is, how do you fix it? With the way to fix it is to let it flood now and then, and folks who live in the floodplain don't much like that. And so there is an effort to restore by returning to some of the original hydrodynamics. That's costly. So now the question is where the money comes from. The Louisiana Levee Board, a new semi-constitutional state board, early this year sued 90 oil companies for having canalized and channelized this whole region while they were searching for oil and gas in wetlands, in part to get the money to do the restoration. So it's trillions of dollars to quote unquote restore wetlands. So yeah, I think science is now better understood and being applied. The question is, now that we sort of know the dynamics, how do we fund it? As I say, I would love to have. It'd be wonderful to have a board that included, or a council that included, 2 members, like the example we have here, who were sitting down trying to integrate that knowledge into policy making, and then promote that cooperation. I'd love to see folks who could actually integrate the science a little better.
I'm sorry. Yes.
My name's Jill. I have a question for Eric too, regarding the dead zones and the hyper-nutrification of the river. Just because it's such an international problem, the dead zones and the agricultural impacts are an international problem. With your work on the commission, do you see any solutions percolating up? Because the law base for treating those kinds of issues are less strong than with the direct source pollution. So has the commission internationally come up with any ideas?
Well, okay, so no and yes. The solution in the U.S. really is going to be about the non-point source program under the Clean Water Act. It's really about, ag, and that's a domestic issue. And the commission can't. The North American Commission tries to stay away from that. I mean, that's a tough enough issue domestically, right? We all like food. We need to eat. Farmers like to produce it for less dollars per acre and higher productivity. So that's a tough one. And that's got to be a U.S. solution, and I see movement in that direction. What the commission is doing, interestingly enough, actually relates to climate change, and I guess we'll get there later today. But they've been funding a lot of really interesting work on so-called blue carbon, and this is coastal wetland carbon sinks. It turns out, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know the science, I didn't until I was appointed liaison to this particular project last year, that wetlands, and not just coastal, although they're focused coastal right now, and upland wetlands are carbon sequestration machines that are 20 to 30 times, depending on the region, more efficient than rainforests. And we've been all running around, and the international climate negotiations have created this RED program to reverse the destruction of forests, especially rainforests, to sequester and hold carbon. It turns out our wetlands have been doing it 20 or 30 times more efficiently. And so that's one thing the Commission's doing. Now, how does that relate to ag? Well, what it does is it creates yet another basis to protect coastal wetlands. As if storm surge protection and, hey, nature wasn't enough, we can now say, oh, by the way, these are carbon sinks, and we can bank it. And so internationally, if we can quantify it, we can protect it by trading it. And so and it's a little tough to quantify, but I know I'm getting past this for folks who don't really follow the climate issue, but greenhouse gas banking, if you can sequester it, makes it, is an increasing international phenomenon. And so the Commission's doing a lot of work on the primary research relating to these blue carbon sinks, and thinking about how to start quantifying that so it can be part of a banking system. So far, it's been tough to get, a handle on at an international level.
Okay, over here. He's bringing the mic.
So just to build on that, even though we have a climate panel, I think we can't talk about water without discussing climate as well. So in the models that you, for all three panelists that you've been studying most closely, some of which predate our awareness of climate change, is climate becoming a catalyst? Do you see it affecting or motivating or rerouting the way those models are dealing with issues?
Julia, do you want to
Sure, yeah.
start?
I'll jump in. So certainly for tribes in the Colorado River Basin, which is who we're mostly talking with for this project, climate change and drought in the Colorado River Basin is definitely a catalyst for tribes trying to ensure that they actually have access to any water. And of course, as settlements come through, most tribes are giving up some of the water they have a legal right to in exchange for infrastructure and other things. But having access to any unallocated water that other people aren't going to fight tooth and nail over giving up is important. So I think that's definitely the case for tribes.
Well, I'm waiting to hear what the council's doing, and I can tell you that I've looked a lot at the Columbia River Treaty, and the review that just wrapped up in 2014 specifically highlighted, on both sides of the border, it was a review done by the U.S. entity as well as a Canadian entity, both sides of the border identified climate as a major driver for future policy. It's really going to affect snowfall, it's going to affect seasonality, periodicity, so it's been identified as a big issue, and a couple of professors, Barbara Cousins, I want to say she's at Idaho, and Nigel Banks at Calgary, both in 14, I think, did a wonderful paper sort of drawing on that and building on it. So, yeah, at least that model, that's a big issue. I haven't seen a lot of focus in the Great Lakes yet on climate, other than the extra basin transfer prohibition from 2005 to 8, by the time it got ratified, in part was driven by southwestern states looking at the Great Lakes and wanting to build a water pipeline. And there were all these great billboards that went up showing, the southwestern states, New Mexico with a sombrero, and Colorado with a cowboy hat, all of them with straws dipping into the Great Lakes, and this public campaign against letting the Great Lakes waters be taken to the desert southwest. And so that's a bit of a climate driver, but I haven't seen it more explicitly. The Mississippi, yes, has to be, because just transportation. 2 summers ago, they were dredging the main channel. Shipping was stopped in the Mississippi River because of seasonal flow variation, and that's just going to continue to change. So they're certainly looking at it there.
Absolutely, yeah. At the council level, most of that modeling is done for purposes of the power plan, but it certainly does inform us about what we can expect for changes with respect to the habitat ecosystem for the fish populations. We ourselves don't do much climate modeling for the fish ecosystem side. That would be left to NOAA or individual states and tribes. I know the tribes are very active. I see Brian Upton out there. I'm not sure if CSKT is doing any work in that area, but I do know that the Mid-Columbia tribes are very actively involved in that kind of modeling. So, yeah, right now the projections in our current draft power plan are showing that we're not going to be in big trouble in the next 5 years. There must be enough water in the system to keep us all afloat, but it's certainly something we're keeping our eyes on, and also working across the border with Canada to try and keep an eye on this issue. So, so that's good.
Nick, was there another question over there behind you? And then we'll come over to Graham here.
Yeah, I have a question for, I guess it would be posed to Julia. You talked, and it seems like the winter's rights are usually applied in, traditionally for in-stream flows, and that's kind of how they were founded. Have you seen, or do you see an application for that broader, for those rights to be applied more broadly in terms of an ecological preservation tool on the scale of like oceans or ocean fisheries rather than river or stream-based fisheries?
That's a really interesting question. So actually, I guess I wasn't clear. I think the majority of winters rights are actually conceived as irrigation rights. They're often, the language in the treaty says something about developing agricultural communities, essentially. So that's often the fight, is actually moving them from agriculture to other more traditional uses, cultural and ecological. And in terms of oceans, I don't know. I actually think that in terms of habitat protection, there are probably some really good arguments, but water rights-wise, I don't think that winters rights probably apply to oceans. So I don't know. That is definitely a question for someone else who knows more about coastal water rights.
So before, do you have an impression yourself, or sort of a train of thought in terms of where you're going with that?
Well, the Western District of Washington in 1981 thought it did, but the Ninth Circuit disagreed when I guess, the end of Phase 2 U.S. v. Washington litigation, whether the treaty rights implied habitat protection. The district court found that the explicit language of the treaty did also be used for the preservation of water rights. That also was a catalyst for habitat protection. The Ninth Circuit disagreed. But then it's been 35 years since that happened, so it's development law and the realities of fishery decline.
Yeah, I think in the handbook we do some discussion about habitat protection as something that I think there are strong arguments for in the law, even despite that Ninth Circuit case. I would agree with you on that point.
Okay. Grant, there's a mic right behind you. Doesn't work.
Hold on to it.
Hi. So I was, for Julia, I guess as you know and discussed, the nature of the relationship between state-based water users and tribal entities as they've reached these compacts and moved through the process has been one that's characterized by sort of an adversarial relationship. And I'm wondering from your research if you see any models for success in sort of bridging that gap to bring state-based water users and now tribes, as we move towards implementing these reserve rights compacts, to sort of bridging that gap and having successful cooperation between state users and tribal entities?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And obviously there are some reasons, both historical and modern, that there are those conflicts. I think I had the opportunity to spend some time in the Klamath River Basin where their compact was successfully negotiated, and now it sounds like it's not necessarily going to get funded by Congress. But I think there were some really, really powerful stories of a coming together of state interest and tribal interest, and I think with a lot of negotiations, the
the key is, of course, finding those points of agreement and reasons for collaboration. I mean, obviously, we're all living in the same places, and so protecting the places, I think, are often the piece that brings people together.
Great. Other questions? Well, very good. I think we're about back on track. So maybe I'll provide the panel members an opportunity for a last word real quick. In terms of sort of further developing and building on this special sauce that the solicitor talked about last night, I mean, two important sort of additional ingredients that seems to me come out of this panel is scientific learning, which we talked about, and then one that Jennifer mentioned, sort of just not so much glossing over, but we haven't really sort of dug into it, is outcomes. And sort of producing positive outcomes where people can see that in the case of, for example, the Columbia, in terms of fish conservation, in terms of energy production, we see positive things happening out on the ground and through communities, through tribal governments and so forth. Is it perfect? No, probably not. But those outcomes, in a way, can provide that sort of feedback and that additional incentive and catalyst to continue to work together. So I just want to sort of put that out there as well. But let me just, by way of closing, maybe we'll just go down the line, and Jennifer, Julia, and Eric, if you have a closing thought or comment.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that thought. Yeah, objectives and outcomes, that's really important. I mean, all of this work costs money, and for me, I'm accountable to the people who pay, the ratepayers who pay for this work to happen. Many of others are accountable to taxpayers or whomever. But yeah, results are important, and to get that message out will really legitimize the cause. So that's good work.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who are tribal advocates, a lot of the work is, unfortunately, sort of basic education of communities about federal Indian law, about tribes and their position as sovereign entities, and so I think there's lots of work to be done. But I think there is a lot of hope, and there are some good examples of success. So I have hope.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'm going to be optimistic too. Three things that matter, right? Education. Not just the kind of education you guys are getting here, world-class legal education, but public, knowledge. I joked a few minutes ago about some of our presidential candidates responding to questions about climate change by saying, "I'm not a scientist." Well, they're not economists either, and they're not really anything that directly is trained to do what they're doing. So the public has to be educated, and we have to know science. We have to connect the dots. And that's the job of lawyers as advocates, is to educate. Just treat the world as a jury and make sure that they stay awake while you're working your way through the problem. The conversation's critical, and we have to have that, and that's why I think institutions matter, because they bring people together to have the conversation. The fact, like you have folks like Jennifer, the fact that you have people close enough to the head of power that governors appoint them, and yet they have a responsibility to their public, in this case ratepayers, but they're liaisons in a way, and that's critical. And third, public access, which again, that's a mechanism for public access. Institutionalize it, repeat it, do it as often as possible, because that's a two-way street of education and informing government. To me, those are really the keys that's part of the special sauce, I think.
Very good. Well, let's give this panel a round of applause.